maybe let's start with you, Mrs. Lasgard. Now, while your husband was deployed, either stateside or to Afghanistan, did the Department of Defense or the Department of Veterans Affairs ever contact you in any way?
No.
Do you think it would have been helpful to have heard from one or both of those agencies with regard to benefits or just soliciting from you information or the needs of certain services to make things easier?
I'm not sure if it would have. Like I said, our Family Assistance Center, they do what they can to train, to train the families and the soldiers coming home and provide as much information as they can. So that's what information we did get.
And looking back then at both of those deployments, what information that you didn't have at the time that you now have would have been critical for you to know? Can you think of anything off the top of your head?
No.
And that's something, if you would submit something in writing to the subcommittee, if you think that, and I know it's hard to think back to both of those and what information you may not have had at the time, but it goes a little bit to the question I'm going to ask our 3 service members from the Air Force Base, because they all participated in TAP, and each one of you said in your testimony that in that last day, either the last day or last half day, you learned of veterans' benefits that you didn't realize you were entitled to, perhaps, or didn't have all the full scope of information. And the same would be true of our members of the Guard and Reserve, particularly those who may separate from service after deployment. But in light of the testimony of the 3 of you, would you recommend that the Transition Assistance Program be made mandatory, or do you think that there are trade-offs in making it mandatory where perhaps people wouldn't get as much out of it if it were mandatory versus the word of mouth, Ms. Krebs, that you described from those who raved about how important and beneficial the program was? If each of you could respond about whether or not you think it would be good to make it mandatory.
I think it would be good to make it mandatory. I think the problem comes in is that it is a 3-day class, and then there's another half-day class for the disabled veterans part, and it's with the ops tempo and the deployment rates, it's really hard, I think, and I don't know when you would target it, because there's a lot of people, there's so much information given. It's really recommended, kind of the word that goes around is that you take it almost a year to a year and a half before you're going to separate, and then about 6 months, 4 to 6 months before you separate. So I think it's good. Ultimately I think it should be mandatory. I just don't know how you would work it into, like I said, our ops tempo and stuff like that.
I also vote for making it mandatory. I think we could implement it even as not a 3.5-day class, but lengthen it to a 5 or more day class with all the information that we're bombarded with. 5 is probably realistic with the ops tempo and so on, but we could make it like the NCO Academy. Of course, not a 6-week program or more, but a 1 or 2-week program where maybe at the 6 or the 9-month point, it's just part of the transitioning out program. It's, yeah, I'm very much in favor for it.
I also feel it should be mandatory. In fact, I think it should be longer. I also have younger airmen that don't have a year and a half to plan, that they have decided to not re-enlist. So it's very difficult for them to decide within a few months how they're going to proceed from this point, especially with the GI Bill changes and the things that come along. We don't know how those benefits are going to play out. So it is helpful, and I think we should work it in somewhere within the academy or somewhere within our service time. It is difficult to find the time, but it should be made, time should be made for those that can attend that course.
Yes, Ms. Krebs. There was one other thing that I'd like to see maybe added. I know it's not specifically a veterans thing, but when you leave the military, especially for retirees, there's a lot of stuff that is specific to the military that's not a veteran program, such as the TRICARE or the survivor benefit plan, and a lot of those things, just your retirement pay. A lot of those would be nice to see added, or a specific class held for, make it mandatory for military people, instead of having to go to 20 different offices where you could go to one location and get it done. Thank you.
bit more efficient perhaps. And then you had said something that's Krebs in your testimony about the helpful information on our website about converting military terminology to civilian terminology. We've heard this from other witnesses, either in DC or field hearings. Are you familiar with anyone who didn't take advantage of the TAP program that really struggled as it related to that terminology conversion, or now that this is maybe on a website, is that more easily accessible for service members as an assistance tool in preparing for finding employment in the civilian sector?
I don't know specifically of anybody who hasn't taken the program. Like I said, Ellsworth has a great one, and I did a year over in Korea, and they have a great one there. And pretty much word of mouth gets around, and you get into the program. I just know, like I said, as soon as you figure it out, it's like the light goes off. Because military, you know, I talk about the military culture, and we do have terminology that just, if you don't know, it just doesn't translate easily. So the website is a great thing, but I don't know of anybody specifically, unless you guys do, that maybe struggle.
We had one member in our class last week who took out all the military acronyms and then had a civilian friend proof it also. And that civilian friend found 2 acronyms that he had sworn he had everything out of there. So it's valuable.
My husband, coming back from Central America, the TAPS program is not available at the base where he was located for his info. And without this course, I know that he would struggle, I would struggle coming home, trying to retire without having the knowledge gained at TAP. It's invaluable to at least have the ideas out there and available. I believe it should be mandatory because most of these people that are struggling when they separate don't realize how difficult and how different it is in the civilian sector to find a job. I think it's very helpful and it should be enhanced, if anything.
That's very helpful. With the ranking member's indulgence, I just have one more question for Mr. Lasseter for recognizing him for questions. But one comment too is that I think Mr. Koopman, you had said something about it should be longer because you're just bombarded with all of this information. I think that's how members of the National Guard feel when they are in their demo site, right? And that's where, and we're going to have General Dewin testify as well about some steps that have been taken to try to, follow up on some of this information at times where it's, versus TAP, which is you're sort of looking at retiring perhaps, or looking at leaving. Now we're looking at a compressed time frame after a deployment. And I think, Ms. Geoffrey, you had mentioned kind of pre-deployment, post-deployment, and TAP. And what I think that if you could comment, and you had already specifically mentioned it'd be nice if you could have more of that demobilization time at Camp Rapid than at Fort Carson. Do you think if you had more demob time at Camp Rapid, that would make it easier for processing some of the information that they're giving you about benefits and programs, and maybe having family there to help participate versus being at Fort Carson just being focused on getting home?
I personally believe that the big problem was, okay, once we were stateside, we knew we were stateside, we knew we were just about home. It was real hard to sit and concentrate on a lot of the briefings that they were giving us. I feel that if we would have been home and if we could see our family, that it would have been easier to concentrate and maybe to integrate some of the briefings they were giving us with the family, because there's a lot of that at that point in time, I can honestly tell you, I wasn't concentrating on. And with the spouse there or other family members, they might have caught something that we wanted to say, hey, this is what they said, this is what you need to do.
Thank you. Mr. Bozeman.